Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian. This is Paul, and in this video I want to explain why I'm a Cartesian dualist. Now, this has to do with my research, which looks at artificial intelligence and basically the difference between learning and memorization in artificial intelligence. So let me talk a little bit about neural networks first. If you know this stuff, this will be pretty basic when it comes to just understanding AI from a deep learning perspective. But let's look at what's called an ANN, or an artificial neural network, and what it is and what it's actually doing here. So the fundamental unit here is what's called the artificial neuron, which usually basically takes this linear method of compute and simply adds a nonlinearity after it. So the artificial neurons are loosely inspired by biological neurons, which are connected to each other, and then what'll happen with the neuron is eventually it activates, it basically fires when it receives a certain amount of electrical or chemical signals. Is basically the rough overview. So what we can do with these computers is we can construct these artificial neurons, which basically take in a bunch of inputs, multiply each of those inputs, and then just add them all together. And from there, you can create an activation function, which basically determines whether or not the artificial neuron, fires or not. So usually what you do is you take an affine term. So you say, okay, I'm going to have some value, which is just, this is a super basic inner product, so multiply and add, and then you add this affine term at the end, which is just kind of like an offset. It's called the bias, usually. And then all you simply do is you add a nonlinearity, because if you didn't add a nonlinearity and you just stack these together, you could reduce this all pretty easily to a nice linear system or affine system, and it would be pretty trivial to solve. So what you do here is you add a nonlinearity, so you're actually causing the activation to maybe have some sort of reason for turning on. So some of these nonlinearities are like the sigmoid or the rectified linear unit, which is if it's below or negative, it's 0, and then after it will turn on. So it's basically deciding when the artificial neuron actually fires and what that curve looks like. So if we look here at what's going on here, you have two parameters of each artificial neuron. You have W, which forms the weights, which you can usually stack into a matrix or a tensor, depending on how you're representing it. And B is usually a value, or you can stack them into a vector or tensor that basically forms the offset. So really the point here is that you have these parameters you can adjust that determine when and how the neuron kind of fires, depending on the different inputs. And what you do is you basically build these artificial neurons up into what's called a multi-layer perceptron. So you can stack them into layers, and then you can just add, each of these would be a layer where you have a bunch of them, and then you can have a bunch of layers. That creates the multi-layer perceptron. And then what we mean when we say deep learning is thus, just having a lot of these layers. I mean, you just go deep. You have network depth, and then network width would be the number of inputs. It's kind of weird because I'm like saying width and I'm talking about it up and down, but that's usually the way we represent it. So think about adding more x's. If you were to connect these once, to each other, it's kind of imperfect, but that would be like adding width. And then depth would be like feeding the outputs of these neurons into other neurons and doing that again and again in this sort of feedback mechanism. But usually you would have extra layers. So this is just, super, super basic overview of how deep learning would work. Now, what we kind of see in neural networks is actually a sort of Cartesian dualism, or a sort of dualism in and of itself. So consider the network architecture like brain structure. So the actual orientation of how neurons are connected to one another, not thinking about the weights or anything, but just saying, okay, where these neurons go. If you look at these are two different types of networks, and basically those numbers there determine the width of each layer in a certain case. And you can construct these in a lot of different ways. And you can consider these different architectures almost like different bodies or heads or brains that have different structures or different ways of connecting the different neurons together. Likewise, you also have what is sort of the parameters of the neural network, which is kind of like the mind. So this is the actual value of the weights and the biases at each layer. And the hidden layers are just the layers of artificial neurons that are not between what you put into the network and what you get out. And what you typically do is you by training the network, you put in a specific input, and then it produces some output. At first you have no idea what this output really means, and you try to make that output look like an output that you want it to have. So if you want it to classify pictures of dogs and cats, you give it a picture of a dog, and it puts out some output, and you say, I want this to look like the output I'm specifying for a dog. You take the difference, that gives you basically a derivative, and you can backpropagate this derivative through the network using just Newton's method. I mean, it's really pretty straightforward stuff, just gradient descent type of stuff. And if you consider the collection, so this is just like a set, the collection of all weights and biases in the network. So this would just be the set of all weights and biases from each layer, from each artificial neuron. This is literally like the mental state of the neural network to a certain extent. So as a result, with this in mind, what you can see here is we can do a lot of weird things with neural networks. So one of the things we can do is copy the network. So say I have a neural network here, and it has a set of weights and biases that correspond to the different neurons. And what I can do is I can take this structure and just copy the structure over. And I can take the weights in the first network and copy the weights in over as well. So now I have two copies of the same network. So this would be like taking somebody and their body, and you take their body and you somehow create a new body that, and a new like brain or something that's pretty much blank or whatever. And then you then fill in the mental state of this new body that you've created with the weights and biases of an existing body. That's kind of what's going on here. You create a new location in memory where you're going to store all this stuff, and then you just copy the actual parameter values into this new structure. The other thing we can do is roll back. So this would be like putting, I mean, this is an imperfect analogy, and I'll talk about the problems with these analogies in a minute. But this would be like, let's say you save the content of your brain now, and then 30 years from now, you took and basically put your old brain into your head at a later time. So you would have all your memories from 30 years ago, but none of your new memories. It's not that you're erasing the memories, it's just that you're replacing your brain with your brain state that you had 30 years previously. So what this would look like is if you have a neural network with a bunch of parameters, you just save those parameters, copy them, and save them at a different location in memory. And then you continue training the network, you continue running the network. And if you continue training it, you're going to have a new set of parameters, a new set of weights and biases at a later time. And what you can then do is sort of roll back the state. So what you do is you take these and you delete them, or you just overall replace them with the saved weights and biases you have stored in memory. And this is kind of a weird thing to think about. But you can do really weird things. You can, like, for instance, swap. If you have two networks that have been trained, you can actually swap the mental state of them, which in a Cartesian dualist sense would be like, if you ever thought about, it's like Freaky Friday, right? You and somebody else, you switch brains, but you're in a different body or a different location, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. So that would be one way you could do this is I have a set of weights and biases, and I have another set maybe from another network, or they're just stored on the disk, or I've just somehow created them in some other way, and I can just take the weights and biases that I had in this network and store them somewhere else and move these other weights and biases into the network. And the analogy here would be like, you know, the Freaky Friday analogy, especially if W's and B's went to a different network. Then, of course, you can delete these, which would be like killing off the mental state, and put the original ones back in. So this would be like they find out that they just had to love themselves or something, would be that. But there are some problems here. This is an imperfect analogy, but we should still talk about it. So one thing is that our minds aren't really doing back propagation. So artificial neural networks and biological networks are not exactly the same, although I think the general idea here sticks. So even if your minds aren't doing back propagation, even if they're doing something more similar to Geoffrey Hinton's forward type of algorithm, you could still do this same thing with these other types of networks that are trained, because you have to store the weights and biases in the computer regardless. You have to store the neural parameters there, which is different than the structure. But the big if here is if our minds are reducible to the electrical states of neurons, then such of these things are possible in principle. Now, that is a big if, and you're going to get a lot of people who disagree with this. But if it's possible that everything in our mental state is simply the activity of neurons, then you could, in theory, copy what the activity of neurons are doing and just basically create another brain that had the same neural connections, and you would just have to make sure that the firings and the connections were exactly the same. The other reason this is an imperfect analogy is when we think about things and we learn stuff, our brains actually make new connections, and we're consistently building new neural connections and neurons. And with these networks, they're not usually, at least at the current state of research, we're not usually constructing new neural pathways as we're training the network. We're usually updating existing neural pathways. But in theory, such a thing would be possible. But once again, just having new neural pathways is different than the structure itself is different from the actual values of those parameters there. Another question we can ask is, are these networks, are these neural networks that we're building in computers, are these actually conscious entities? Do they have a mental state the way we have mental states? And perhaps a more fundamental question we should ask before we can even attach that question is, suppose they were conscious or not? I mean, how would we know? How would we be able to differentiate if they were or not? And even if, because we can't answer this question that we could know in principle that they're conscious, answering the question of whether they are conscious or not that's a question we would need to ask later once we have some way of determining whether or not they could be conscious. And honestly, it just depends who you ask. There are a lot of people who think different things. David Chalmers, Daniel Dennett, Thomas Nagel, they're all going to give you different answers. These are some of the people that have at least done some thought and work in this area. So they'll give you different answers depending on the certain system. I like Chalmers' view about the hard problem of consciousness. He's obviously was very influenced by Thomas Nagel, who in his really famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, is basically saying, there's a way you could think about this as basically saying, even if such a network was conscious, how it'd be very hard for us to understand or even come to know that it was conscious, let alone how it was conscious or what its conscious experience was like. Like, what is it like to be a neural network is like a weird sort of question, but certainly things to think about. But I do think what this suggests is that mental content is separate from mental structure. And this is where we get dualism. Like, if you were to copy all the neurons from my brain into the neural structure into a new biological thing of a bunch of different neurons connected, if the firings weren't the same as they were now, then maybe the question is, where are these memories stored? Is it stored in the are my memories stored in the firings of neurons? Or are they stored in the actual neural structure, the connection between neurons and the structure itself? And answering that question would help us understand a little bit more about what's actually going on here. But since we see this sorts of dualism here in neural networks, I think it's reasonable to at least think there could be a similar sort of dualism going on in biological networks. So let me know what you guys think. Do you think, are you a Cartesian dualist? Like I used to be kind of a monist about these things, but these sorts of arguments have kind of caused me to reconsider Cartesian dualism. And if you're interested in learning more about it, this is a weird suggestion. Check out the video game AI The Somnium Files by Kotaro Uchikoshi. Really interesting video game that goes into Cartesian dualism. Can't recommend that enough. Anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are. Yeah, have a good one.